Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. In July 2016, Kashmiri freedom fighter Burhan Wani was killed by Indian forces. This killing evoked a wave of strong uprisings throughout Indian-occupied Kashmir. The region was put under a draconian lockdown, and force and violence was used against protesters. Wani's killing was seen to be a watershed event, an event which undisputedly strengthened the indigenous movement for freedom. It was also a moment for Kashmir's narrative to be highlighted, not just by Kashmiris, but the world at large. Still, disappointingly, the world failed to listen to what Kashmir was saying. 3 years later, Kashmir now, once again, but worse than ever before, stands isolated and silenced. It's been almost a month since India cut off Kashmir from the world. The conflict this time has shifted from being a dispute regarding freedom and now is a fight for survival. There is massive concern, as human rights organizations state, regarding genocide and ethnic cleansing in the region. As those within Kashmir are unable to communicate with the world because of all communications being suspended, it's imperative to those on the outside to speak for the cause. At times like these, global leaders, powerful social media influencers, celebrities are looked towards. And yet the silence on their part is deafening. On today's show, we talk about whether or not opinion leaders should be at the forefront of speaking up for those who are oppressed. Joining us for this discussion today is Dr. Lyal S. Sunga, human rights expert, joining us from Rome, and Mr. Dean Russel, analyst, joining us from London. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Sunga, now let me begin with you. In cases like this, in which a state such as India that has acted unilaterally in what was recognized to be an international dispute, what type of diplomatic international pressure should be placed on that state?
Well, there's a number of things that should be done, and which some of the things are being done, but you're right that not enough pressure has been brought to bear on India and it's Modi's unilateral action here, and also to violate Article 370 of the Indian Constitution, which guaranteed Kashmir a considerable autonomy. When I say that there have been some things done, Security Council did meet very recently, just 2 weeks ago, on the Kashmir situation. Mm-hmm. And also China, coming out of the meeting, issued some statements that it was very concerned, and I would agree with the Chinese position, that which also has a stake in this as well, as you know. But I agree with the Chinese government that peaceful negotiation
right.
and peaceful settlement of disputes is the way to go. Now that's what the United Nations is for. It is a decentralized system. It's not that it's not a world government. It doesn't have a standby army that can return the situation to the status quo. And there's, in default of a threat or breach of international peace and security in Chapter 7 powers, which the UN is not going to invoke in this kind of situation, then you're into Chapter 6 of the UN Charter, which is peaceful settlement of disputes. And the ICJ, many years ago, I think it was in 1949, already made clear to India that they have an obligation, they should withdraw troops. India has around 600,000 troops in Kashmir.
Well, now Pakistan, even more so after what has been done in Kashmir.
And they should hold a referendum to make sure that the principle of the right of peoples to self-determination is respected.
Right.
And that has not been done.
Right. Mr. Russell, now India's narrative on all of this has been that it's an internal dispute. This narrative was, of course, debunked when all these countries met at the United Nations Security Council. But seeing how belligerent India is in this matter, what needs to be done in practical steps so that the country is at least brought to the table to have a discussion? Because it seems like nothing so far is being done.
I think this goes back to the traditional concept of dialogue, and I think all parties need to be discussing what to do next. I think one of the challenges here is around the complexity of the history of the region, and I know from an external perspective, talking from the UK, I don't think the rest of the world fully comprehends how challenging the dynamic is in Kashmir. I've got a lot of friends from Kashmir, and I think one of the difficulties they find on all sides is the conversation around it. there's so many domestic agendas at the moment in all countries, and especially in the superpowers, whether it be trade wars, whether it be elections. And I think the problem there is that means that distracts from anything talking around issues in Kashmir and other places around the world.
Right. So, Mr. Russel, I get the argument that since it is such a politicized dispute with so much happening within it, many people, especially powerful people in positions such as, celebrities or social media activists, would take a step back and wouldn't want to get mixed up in the situation. But now, after a month of lockdown in the region, these people not having access to healthcare, them not being able to even communicate to their families outside of Indian-occupied Kashmir regarding whether they are alive or whether they're healthy. This is a humanitarian crisis, almost black and white, the situation. Why don't you think that people are now talking about the humanitarian crisis? Why aren't they focusing on that? Why aren't opinion leaders coming out with a more bold and a more hardline stance?
I think there's an element that people are, on the wider scale, are concerned about offending one party or another. I think there's a real challenge here in terms of understanding, as I say, the domestic issues, the international issues, and also the wider context of what's going on in the world. I think there's so many campaigns nowadays running internationally around humanitarian issues. I think Kashmir, sadly, seems to be lost in the mix a little bit, even though it affects so many different people, so many different nationalities. And I think the challenge, in a way, is starting to break down some of the conversations around what's been happening there, what the legacy is, and also starting to get more people more broadly talking around Kashmir in a more general sense, so that people get a sense of what actually is going on and what the history is there.
Right. Mr. Sunga, talking a little more about this, now an issue running parallel to what is happening in Kashmir on a basis of a humanitarian crisis. I'll take the example of the fires in the Amazon. Now, in this show, too, we have highlighted how important that issue is to talk about and how that's disastrous for humanity. And we do see a lot of people coming forth and talking about it. But at the same time, almost 10 million people, their lives are at stake. Now, what's the difference between these two situations? I mean, speaking out against Bolsonaro's government could also cause offense to the Brazilian people. What's the double standard here?
It's no excuse that that people don't act, because this situation is getting much worse. It's there are a lot of very serious violations going on. These are well documented by human rights organizations, and they're recognized by the United Nations. So definitely, this situation's getting in a very bad way, and I don't think one can compare. Your question goes to political mobilization, and the environment is in a way much easier for people to understand than maybe the Kashmir conflict, which is a little bit convoluted in some respects. But what shouldn't be convoluted and what should be crystal clear, and I think you're making this point very well, is that...
Mr. Sunga, sorry to interrupt here, but you mentioned political mobilization here. What I do want to ask is, why do you feel like at this moment in time, when we're talking about political mobilization being essential, do you feel like it is selective empathy on any part? There is this claim that with the rise in Islamophobia around the world and the fact that these are Muslims who are suffering, people aren't coming out enough and talking about the issue. Had this been happening somewhere else, the reactions might have been different.
It's quite possible because, for example, in the Rohingya situation, and in other situations involving instances where Muslims are victims, the sympathy may be less from the West because of the fear of terrorism and Islamophobia and out-and-out racism. It's quite possible. It's very hard to determine how much of that plays a role. I would like to think that when it comes down to it, that people are much more humane in their attitude and less discriminatory. But I don't think, what you're saying could be discounted, and I think it could play a larger roll with fears of terrorism that get whipped up. And, and the situation of Kashmir.
Right.
Pakistan, Imran Khan has played a very restrained role, and glad to see that. And I hope he doesn't get provoked by the very provocative actions of the Modi government, which are quite shameful up to this point on Kashmir.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Sunga, for joining us and taking out the time to talk to us.